Hi, you're listening to the Colourworks podcast, a monthly podcast for business owners and managers looking to improve the way that their people work together. We are specialists in people development, with particular applications in team working, leadership, customer service, and organisational culture. We've been going since 2003 and have so far had the pleasure of working with over 100,000 people across the private, public and not-for-profit sectors. Our mission is to create vibrant workplaces in which all people feel valued and get heard, where communication is honest and clear, decision-making timely and robust, and authentic leadership filters throughout the organisation.
Hello and welcome to the Colourworks podcast. My name is James Hampton and I'm the Development Director for the Colourworks. My role here at the Colourworks is to design and deliver bespoke solutions and support our team in delivering them to our clients' needs. Today we're going to be exploring well-being and resilience, and to do so, I'm joined with Peter Radford from Beyond This. Peter is a motivational speaker and an expert in the well-being space. Welcome aboard, Peter.
Hello.
So Peter, tell us a little bit about your business and what you do.
I speak to students, schools, to businesses, leaders, all sorts of organizations. And what I'm passionate about really is helping people fulfill their potential, be the best that they can be, and live life well, effectively. So I speak and run workshops and leadership training in a range of settings around those sorts of motivational well-being and pursuing your goals and achieving your goals type issues.
Brilliant. It's quite a hot topic at the moment, well-being and resilience. Yeah. It's the words out there on everyone's lips within organizations, but ultimately quite a unique industry to be in. What led you to be in the well-being space?
Yes, very much my own personal journey. So I've started my career in youth work, went into teaching, and then rose into senior leadership very quickly. And it was in that role of senior leadership, very large organization, that over a period of years, I was aware that I was increasingly spinning more and more plates, just to use an analogy. The business of life, the business of work, the business of leading a large organization. And it was, for me, I always felt like I could cope. I felt like I went at life fast. I went at it passionately. I felt like I was invincible, could handle anything. And things started to implode. I had a new boss at one particular point, and the workload remit that I had significantly changed, was increased. And at first I kind of thought, well, I'm not sure how I can manage all of this. There was no sort of let up seemingly. But I thought, right, I need to attack, need to go at it perhaps with a different angle, try and work smarter, work faster, kind of delegate more. And I was just aware that I had more and more plates spinning, and there was that overwhelming feeling that some of these plates were starting to wobble, some of them were starting to fall, and it was literally becoming impossible to manage that level of stress and that pace of working. And I, with retrospect, looking back now, I can see that there were mild panic attacks I was having on a daily basis, right, which I would not have been aware of at the time. And I had a moment, it was quite a significant moment, where I sat at my computer one day in my office, trying to juggle the priorities and what I needed to do that particular day. And I had just almost a premonition, a kind of a flash forward, where I foresaw a moment where everything would just come crumbling down, where suddenly I would sit back and be unable to actually do anything at all. And I'd heard of people, and people I'd known, and people close, family as well, who'd had breakdowns and never really quite understood that. I didn't know how to get my head around that. And I suddenly saw it, and I thought it scared me, and I thought I need to do something about this. I need to nip this in the bud. And I went to my boss and I said, I'm not coping. I then took some time off, just a week at first, then a second week, but I was still trying, because I felt my sort of own sort of sense of pressure and sense of expectations that I placed on myself, felt incredibly guilty about taking time off work and that impinging on other people's workload, and felt bad about that. So I was trying from home even though I'd been signed off with stress, to try and keep sort of doing as much as I possibly could to alleviate the sort of the workload of others. And it was 2 weeks in that it all came crumbling down, and I had 2 tasks to do that day. I had to go to Lidl and do a shop, and then make a chili for our friends for evening meal that night. And chili's my signature dish, so that was not something that would normally sort of faze me. But I got to about 2:00. I looked at the recipe for the chili, and I couldn't cope. I felt utterly overwhelmed. About a week later, a similar instance where my wife came home with a grocery shop. I got up to try and help her put the groceries away and had a panic attack. Could not cope with even a very basic task like putting groceries into the shop, into the cupboards. And she told me in no uncertain terms, go and sit down, just go and sit down. And that was the point. That was the low point for me. But it brought me face to face with just how debilitating it is.
Yeah.
When your mental health is not intact, when it's impaired, when your emotional well-being is not good, how far-reaching the knock-on effects of that can be.
Sure, and those panic attacks are incredibly impactful. I think if you haven't actually had them in the past, you don't appreciate the impact it has on your daily functions. The chest compressing and the heart rate going in, and the narrowing of the vision, and it just losing control of the situation.
Horrible.
Intense, very intense.
So that really brought me sort of face to face with a kind of a reevaluation and analysis of, okay, what am I doing? Where do I want to go from here? And over the course of the next few months, I recognized that I needed to get out of the job I was in.
Yeah.
That was the right decision for me. That may not be the case for everybody, obviously. But it also pushed me, because I'd had thoughts prior to start up my own business. And I thought maybe now's the time.
So you took it as an opportunity.
Yeah. I went back to a different workplace, same sector, but part-time, and started my business part-time. Because in some ways as well, that's a hard time to start a new business, because there's a huge amount of anxiety that goes with that, especially when you've been in paid employment your entire life, and this is your first sort of venture of self-employment. And again, so it's been very much a journey that's been ongoing, and I accessed some counselling early on at that stage, and then a year later knew that I needed to access some counselling again, because there were certain things that I was not coping with. And so that journey has led me to kind of have obviously much greater understanding personally about well-being, about mental health in general, working with young people and understanding young people's adolescent mental health over a number of years has helped as well. And that's something I speak regularly about in schools. But recognizing as well that fundamentally, if we as human beings are not well, then our productivity, our output is seriously impeded. Psychologists say that when you're mentally unwell, your cognitive function is impaired by up to 30%. So you literally can't think as clearly, you can't recall things as well, you can't write as lucidly, and so on. And so you take that into the workplace, and you think businesses, organizations, no matter what kind of sector they're in, obviously have a concern about the bottom line, about pushing forward, and sometimes try to bypass their staff on the way to do it. So we set a target, here's where we want to be, or here's sort of the outcome, or the profit margin that we want to make by the end of the year. And almost as if announcing that will make it happen. And then sometimes there's an approach in different sectors that almost sees the employees as a resource to be exploited in pursuit of that goal. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem.
Agreed. Because
you can't bypass your people on the way to success. They are the engine. They are the number one resource that you have, the number one asset that you have. And I'd experienced that firsthand, that sort of workplace culture that sees the workers, the staff, as a resource rather than as partners in a team working towards a jointly owned goal. So that's where I'm coming from. Sorry, long answer.
No, great answer, and thank you for sharing the depth of your personal story. Because when we do find ourselves in these situations, I think it's those personal stories that really bring it to life and make it real for those that we're talking to, rather than just say, "Hey, this is the perfection of what you need to achieve." Yeah. Actually, bringing that heart and soul to these situations is incredibly important. and it resonates with people. So how do you translate that story into your motivational speaking?
I'm very happy to talk about it openly for one thing, and I think that's important as a starting point for one thing, because I think as human beings, we all live life to some extent behind a mask. I love the picture that sometimes you see, or the analogy of an iceberg, and we know that you only see the tip of an iceberg. The majority of the iceberg is beneath the surface.
90%.
And the same with human beings. On our social media channels, we post the best pictures, we the best holiday snaps. We post a kind of update when something's gone well. We don't tend to say had a really crap day today, or share some of our flaws and our vulnerabilities. So therefore, we're constantly comparing ourselves to the best of other people, and that leads to sometimes a low self-esteem or a lack of confidence about ourselves, because all we're seeing and comparing ourselves to is the best of everybody else. So there's a dishonesty sometimes, and there's dishonesty sometimes in our workplaces, an expectation that I ought to come across as if everything's fine, and if I don't come across as if everything's fine, then people might ask questions about me, or people might sort of have less confidence in me,
or I might not be as good as other people. I'd want them to see me.
I'll disappoint people and their expectations, and of course we all come at our jobs as well with a huge amount of baggage from our upbringings and our family relationships, or our significant other relationships, or our schooling and so on. So there's this culture sometimes of dishonesty. So I start and I come at it very much from an honest perspective. Also, I come at it honestly as a male talking about their emotions, and that's something in our British culture that is not as common as it should be. And of course, it's a major issue in that the number one killer in the UK of males aged 25 to 49 is suicide. And arguably a key reason for that is that most males are much less comfortable and likely to talk openly about their emotions as most women are. Most men less likely to go and seek help from a doctor than women are, statistically speaking. Obviously not true of everybody, but as a generalization, that can be an issue. And there's that sort of tendency, and we've all heard it, and some of us have grown up with it in an unhelpful way, that sort of notion that as a male, you should man up, you should not show your emotions, don't be a girl, and that association with emotion, with being feminine or female in some way, which is obviously utter nonsense, but incredibly unhelpful and dangerous. And so I want to kind of challenge that stereotype. So I talk openly about my emotional journey as a male, and I'm quite open and happy to address it that way. Following that, really, I'm keen to look at organizations and workplaces and leaders on a personal level, and recognizing that fundamentally, I think one size does not fit all where human beings are concerned. We are all different, and we need to look at the context of any given workplace, the context of the leaders and the challenges in that particular workplace. And start there, rather than what I don't do is come in with, here's a formula for your success, or here's a formula to make your workplace, a well-being oasis. That's not my approach. So it's starting with the people and the persons there, and the dynamics there, and moving from that to how can we move forward to a more sustainable and hopefully emotionally literate future.
Great. So you talked a little bit about the expectations that we put upon ourselves, which I think is a huge cause for the current state of affairs that we have in organizations around well-being, mental health, and the issues that follow. But throughout your experience of working with these organizations, is there a common theme of pressures that compound the issues that we're facing?
I think there's two big issues in our day and age, you could argue. And I'm always wary of oversimplifying things, because when you boil things down to two or three, of course there's always, in actual fact, 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or a myriad
two or
of
three
issues
we can do something about.
But a couple of things that I think are endemic are one, what I would call our busyness culture. There is a tendency, and whether it's new or not, I don't know, to value ourselves or measure our validity as human beings and as organizations by how busy we are. So I heard someone say there was a time where you would ask somebody, you meet somebody, hi, how are you? And their stock answer would be, I'm fine, how are you? Now you ask someone, how are you? And their stock answer is, busy.
It's true. It's really true.
And what's interesting about it is that we're quite proud of our busyness, and we'll then go into a kind of a list of what we've had to do today and what we've had to cope with, and all of the unforeseen issues that kind of were thrown in from left field, whether those are related to a kind of a sick kid or a traffic jam, and I still managed to get this done. And we're measuring what we're doing subconsciously, not necessarily in a conscious way, but we're saying I am valid and I am valuable because look how busy I am. Now, the problem with that is if we all buy in that together, then it almost leads to a kind of a busyness competition.
Yeah.
And I've sat in staff rooms and communal areas in organizations and heard people bragging about how late they were working until last night, kind of to some extent sort of playing the martyr. Oh, well, I was
a badge of honor.
It's a badge of honor. And then sort of some people came across who deliberately would sort of set their email, send some emails, but set it to send at 3 a.m. in the morning so that it would look to the
copying everyone else in the organization at the same time as well, to weigh in and say, exactly. Here I am being visible.
Look, how committed I am to my job. Now, it's ludicrous and it's obviously totally unsustainable. Yeah. And it's a nonsense because busyness, of course, doesn't equate to productivity. It's very easy to fill time with activity and be no more productive in terms of concrete outcomes as a result. And so I think there's a culture there that needs to be challenged about busyness and about how we measure each other. Heard a really interesting story, which I think is worth telling, which illustrates this. I heard about a guy who was locked out of his house on one occasion, and he called the locksmith. Locksmith came, he fiddled around with the lock for 2 minutes, let the guy in, and then said, that'll be £120, please.
Yeah.
Well, this guy was like, £120? How do you get away with charging people £120 for 2 minutes work? So they started having a chat about how his pricing strategy. And the guy said, 20 years ago, I was rubbish at this job. I'd come here, I'd fiddle around with the lock for half an hour. The guy would be sat on the curb. I'd end up breaking the lock. I'd go off and have to buy a new lock. I'd come back, fit the new lock, let the guy in. Hour and a half later, £120 plus the cost of a new lock. Never had anybody complain. Now, I'm very, very good at my job. I haven't changed my price, but I get regular complaints about how much I charge. Now, I think that what that illustrates is a kind of inbuilt tendency to measure worth by how much you've sweated rather than by how good a job you've done.
Or knowledge or experience.
Yeah.
Knowledge experience.
So that's one thing that I seek to challenge and address in terms of thinking about how we measure progress and productivity and what we value in an organization. The second thing I would say, which is a key issue, is basically top-down leadership structures. Top-down leadership structures, I think, are inherently unhelpful to staff well-being and to building a collaborative workplace where everybody's engaged on board and loving coming to work. Because a top-down workplace or leadership structure tends to be a product of essentially a distrust of human beings. And this, you could trace this back, in the annals of time to St. Augustine in the 4th century, who kind of came up with the Christian doctrine of original sin, that human beings are fundamentally lazy, bad, selfish, and therefore we need to keep an eye on them. We need to kind of breathing down the neck, control, micromanage, because if you leave people alone, they will slack off. They will be unproductive. They will take the mick. And therefore, we approach all of those people that we line manage with policies, with procedures, with structures, with appraisal mechanisms that sometimes are designed to catch people out and breed a sense of fear, a foreboding, a sense of anxiety that what if I don't live up to this expectation? And that actually stifles and cripples people from actually being the best that they can be. And sometimes we've just fallen in and to those sort of leadership structures, or they've been the norm for many, many years. And so what I look to do is just challenge the way that we go about leading, and actually what is it that gets the best out of people? And usually it isn't setting a target, setting a quota, and then cracking the whip to try and make people pursue and fulfill that quota.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, isn't it? The top-down leadership approach. Are you considering looking at organizations in more of a flat-oriented structure or bottom-up and followership style?
Yeah, absolutely. Although I recognize, again, that different organizations in different sectors are different. And obviously I have some dealings with schools. And whilst I recognize that I think on the whole, hierarchical structures don't work. Obviously, there are contexts in which, you're not going to ask all of the 5-year-olds, to what do you think we ought to do today? What play? Well, actually, there's a play. So I'm not going to completely say there should be no directives ever from the top. But I think how you go about certain things misses the point. It's about the underlying culture of do we trust people? Do we invest in our people? Do we see our people as a resource, or do we see them as partners?
Yeah.
And that fundamental difference, I think, makes a huge difference, because actually you're missing something if you see people as a resource, because people will tend to work to your expectations. I heard about IBM some years ago when they were kind of a real market leader in the computer world. At a time when every other computer company had quotas, they didn't have quotas for their staff. And what they noticed was that if you have a quota, then people sort of tend to have an performance anxiety around that quota. So they will tend to think, okay, well, I need to get to that mark, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. So they'll work feverishly to get to that bar. Then when they do, phew, I've made it. I'm not going to be told off. I'm okay now. And they'd stop. Now, if you have a significantly lower quota, a quota that's easy to manage, what IBM were finding was that people very early in the morning would meet that target, that bar, and then kind of think, well, I want to see how much I can do today. And so would challenge and engage themselves, and then think, more broadly about what could we achieve, or how could we go about this, or how could we go about this smarter? So instead of sort of prescribing what people do and therefore having them meet a very narrow objective, actually when you become less prescriptive, you actually unleash your workforce to do what you want them to do, plus A, B, C, and D, and come up with some novel ideas along the way. So yeah, I'm certainly in favor of us rethinking our leadership structures and trusting people and drawing out the best of our people. Obviously, commensurate with their experience and commensurate with their expertise. Yeah. It's not a kind of a case of,
off you go.
Yeah, dropping somebody in sort of first week, first day, right, you're on your own. It's what's known as situational leadership. You lead people appropriate to the situation and appropriate to the experience and expertise of the individual. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be explored in most organizations around that.
Great, that's really interesting. So just to recap on that, the contributing factors to the current state of the lack of well-being in the workplace, we've got self-expectation, social media, how we see ourselves. We've got the badge of honor of weighing in around the email culture and visibility, how late I work justifies my paycheck.
Yep.
And the authoritarian classic top-down leadership, and them not truly engaging with their people and bringing them on this journey. What about getting into the organization? What sort of impact do you think the relationships have on well-being?
Relationships are critical, whether work relationships or the relationships beyond that.
Yeah.
There are various studies around sort of the basic psychological needs of all human beings, and there are arguably 5 or 6 that you could with good authority say are basic psychological needs of all human beings. They are love, a sense of belonging, to feel understood, achievement, a sense of purpose, and a degree of autonomy. Mm-hmm. Now, arguably, those 6 psychological needs, universal, we all need those things. Now, but with the possible exception of love, which, barring those organizations or leaders who see themselves as sort of matchmaking opportunities on the side, I think the other 5 of those psychological needs are directly affected and significantly so by the workplace. And by the culture and the ethos that we build. And they're mostly, a number of those are people related. I'll tell you a really interesting story I came across regarding the history of drug use and misuse and the criminalization of drugs in our society, which took place around about the year 1900. So around about the turn of the 20th century, basically the whole world more or less criminalized drug use. Now, it did so on the basis of an interesting experiment that was done with a rat. They put a rat in a cage with some water and another bottle of some water laced with heroin. And they thought, well, let's see which one the rat goes for. Of course, it drank from the water laced with heroin, then kept on drinking from the water laced with heroin until it drank itself to death. So on the basis of that, they kind of concluded, well, okay, we basically need to keep people away from drugs because otherwise they'll kill themselves. Mm-hmm. And that experiment basically informed drug criminalization policy for the next 70 odd years until about the 1970s. A guy called Dr. Alexander Bruce came along and he looked at this experiment and he thought, I wonder if there's something wrong with this experiment. So he did it again. He put a rat in a cage with a bottle of water and a bottle of water laced with heroin. But in the cage as well, he put some other rats. He put some slides and some balls and some treadmills, and he made a kind of rat park. And the rats drank from the bottle of water, and they drank from the bottle of water laced with heroin, and then they had absolutely no interest in the heroin-laced bottle, arguably because their psychological needs admittedly on a rat level, were being met by the environment, the context that they were in. The cage was the issue, not the exposure to the water laced with heroin. They could easily have accessed that drug, but they had no need for it because their needs were being met by the environment they were in. Now, arguably, somebody says, okay, well, that's rats. Does that apply to human beings? Well, around about the same time, there was an experiment being done with human beings, arguably, which was called the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War, interestingly, the US were shipping out shed loads of heroin to their troops so that figures stand that around about 20% of all American troops were on heroin towards the end of the war. And they had suddenly kind of somebody at the top suddenly thought, oh dear, all of these troops are going to come home. They're all going to be addicted to heroin. How are we going to cope with that? Are we going to need to sort of suddenly build loads of rehabilitation centers to deal with these addicts? Well, what was fascinating was that on return, 95% of soldiers just stopped their drug use immediately with no withdrawal symptoms, no cold turkey. They just stopped. Now, I think this is fascinating because if you relate it to the rat park, you can see what's happening. Suddenly, these soldiers who on the battlefield were lacking love, lacking that sense of belonging, lacking achievement, purpose, a futile war, a war that seemingly was going on unending and achieving very little. That autonomy, just following order, suddenly they come back into society and they're connected again with family, with the community, a purpose broader. And those needs meant that need to self-medicate artificially was no longer there, and even the desire to do so was no longer there. Of course, not suggesting that they came back with no psychological problems. Obviously, we know, but But in terms of the drug addiction, in terms of that need for an artificial fix, that seemingly was not there. So what that speaks to is the need for all of us to have that connectivity. And as leaders in any organization, it's our job, I would suggest, to create the kind of environment where people are able to do their best work. And if we can create the kind of environment and the kind of relationships and facilitate those relationships for collaboration, for working well together, for purpose, belonging, achievement, and autonomy, if we can put those ingredients in place, then we're going to have a workplace where people feel well.
And I think you're absolutely right. And there's some real evidence out there that says the more I feel connected to my workplace, the happier I am.
Yeah.
And if we can create those environments where happiness can flourish, productivity will go through the roof.
Yeah.
And for me, that really does come down to the relationships that you're able to create. And the three matters that you mentioned are weighing in on busyness and that top-down leadership and those self-expectations. Yeah. If we can create that level of communication with people within organizations and have them comfortable in sharing their aspirations and fears and dreams, unguarded and fearless of repercussions on that basis, I think we might go somewhere to healing some of the problems that we're facing. But that doesn't come easy, because you've already mentioned it. We have to have trust with people in order to step into that vulnerability of opening up. So with regards to that, are there any quick tips that you could give organizations to improve their staff well-being?
Quick tips. I think in the first place, a healthy organization is going to be an organization where there is communication, and therefore having regular and meaningful consultation with your staff, with your people, is a no-brainer. You can't bypass that. That sense, I said, that psychological need of feeling understood.
Yeah, appreciated.
Well, to feel understood, you've got to feel like somebody's listening to you. You've got to have an opportunity to say what it is you're feeling. So that's critical, that there are, whether in the format of occasional surveys, but more importantly, in the line manager managee relationship, that there's the opportunity for the employee to say how they're feeling, to feel like their voice is being heard, and to feel like their contribution matters. That's critical. So training leaders, particularly middle leaders, I think middle leadership in most organizations is sometimes where there's a critical issue. Gallup, the polling organization, surveyed 1 million companies, and they found that 75% of people, and this is not a new statistic, it's certainly been repeated many a time, but 75% of people leave their job because of their direct line manager. Yeah. Now, that tells you something. Most of those line managers are probably in a middle leadership role, and often they've been promoted into that middle leadership role because they were good at the job and they showed some competence and expertise, but not necessarily because they understood people or were good at leading people. Yeah. And arguably, many of them may not have had any CPD or development around how to manage people effectively. So investing in just some basics of dynamics of leadership, and I would recommend that ideally all middle leaders do mental health first aid training, so that they have that recognition of the dynamics of how human beings' mental health and emotional well-being works, and that will set them up much more effectively to succeed. Another way to draw feedback from employees is with something called the Gallup 12, which are 12 questions that Gallup over many years have outlined as the 12 questions which best measure employee engagement. And they're well worth looking up. There you can find them. Just Google the Gallup 12. But they're brilliant ways for measuring, and they basically coalesce with 5 of those 6 psychological needs that I mentioned. So doing something like the Gallup 12, investing in your middle leaders and surveying staff on a regular basis, and making sure that you do something with that information, I think is critical. The other thing I think is addressing the degree of autonomy that we give to staff. So questioning how prescriptive we are in our organization and ways of leading our organizations. There's 4 T's that are worth doing some thinking around, both as a leadership team and perhaps with your staff. Daniel Pink talks about these in his book, Drive, which is well worth looking at. And that would be a top tip. Read Drive by Daniel Pink.
That was going to be one of my questions about your favorite books.
Oh, right. Okay, we're coming there. But he mentions as the 4 T's, time, task, technique, and team. And if you can self-assess how much autonomy do your employees have over their time when they come into work, when they knock off, whether it's most effective for them to do some work remotely, how much autonomy is there over time, how much autonomy is there over their technique, the way that they go about what they do. Are you too focused on the way they go about it rather than the outcome? Because surely it's the outcome that matters. How much autonomy do they have over the task itself? And that's where you can potentially unleash and find some far smarter, better ways of achieving your goal, because they may well have some great ideas that you've missed or we've missed simply because, well, this is the way we've always done it, which we all have a tendency to kind of get into a rut and stick in it. And then the 4th one is over team, actually giving some autonomy over who you work with and who you collaborate best with, and using some of those team resources that are out there, like the ColourWorks, like the GC Index, which is a tool that I use, which helps people find their place, their role within a team, and function effectively within that. So that would be my recommendation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pete. Thank you so much. So you've been busy over the last few years with your brand and beyond this. What can we expect over the next few months?
Next few months, I am just finishing a book which is around staff wellbeing. It's actually focused around staff wellbeing in the teaching profession, which is at an unprecedented issue. About 40% of teachers are planning to leave the profession within the next 5 years.
It's a frightening statistic, considering the value they bring to to society.
That is, and the knock-on effect of that, obviously, for we all care about our children. We all, bottom line, we all want our children to have a good teacher as well.
Yeah.
And the system that we've got is unsustainable, and there isn't enough literacy around these sorts of issues. And I think we need to rethink that. So I'm finishing a book on that, which is going to be published and going to be out in September. That's called Love Teaching, Keep Teaching. But a lot of the principles in that are transferable to any kind of workplace. So my next step will be to do a kind of a business edition of that same book. But otherwise, what I'm looking towards is speaking more widely in a range of settings where I have the opportunity. I'm launching a new website, which is jointly called outofthecave.co.uk. It's also going to be under the URL of peterradfordspeaker.com. But my Out of the Cave program is a program that is designed to take organizations and individuals out of the cave. It draws on an analogy that the philosopher Plato used back in the 5th century BC, where he suggests that all human beings live their lives like prisoners locked in a cave. And in the deepest part of that cave, they see shadows on the back wall, and that's all they've ever known. And so their version of reality is the reality that's been presented to them. And we all tend to simply accept the reality that's presented to us. And in Plato's analogy, one of the prisoners escapes and realizes that these shadows, which they thought were real, are in fact just shadows. And there's a reality, there's a truth beyond. Now, I think we're all, to some extent, and in some areas of our lives, we're prisoners trapped in a cave. For me, it wasn't until my 30s that I recognized just how much of a product sometimes we can be. So I'm one of 5 kids, big family, 3 brothers and a sister. My dad was a banker. My mum was a teacher. 5 kids, 4 teachers and a banker. And I thought, and in my 30s, I kind of clocked that for the first time in my 30s. And I thought, hang on, I thought I became a teacher of my own free will.
But we have to question free will.
Yeah, we do. And to some extent, we are all products to some extent. And I think the challenge is to put our finger on that and to identify the areas in which maybe we're holding ourselves back. We've been held back by the expectations of others, by the norms of society, by the pressure of our peers, the expectations of our social class or our, the income bracket that we're in, and to smash through the glass ceiling and get out of the cave. So that's a program that I have taught and delivered already, but I'm launching that via my new website, and then hoping to deliver that in different formats more and more over the coming months, because it really is a dynamic and transformational program.
Fantastic. Sounds really interesting. And how will people get hold of you or connect with you, aside from the URL you gave?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Peter Radford Beyond This, but also peterradfordspeaker.com. You can get hold of me, and outofthecave.co.uk. They're both linked to the same place. And find out more about me there, or drop me a line on peter@beyondthis.co.uk.
Brilliant. Well, Peter, it's been fascinating talking to you and listening to your own personal story and everything that's led you towards what you achieve now. If you'd like to understand more about the Colourworks take on well-being and resilience, log on to www.thecolourworks.com and look under solutions to find more information there. Thanks once again for listening, and have a good day.
We hope you found this episode insightful and interesting. If you want more information on today's topic, then head to thecolourworks.com and look for our Solutions tab on the main menu. If you want to be notified of new podcast releases and other useful people development resources, then please subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on social media @thecolourworks. We're active on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and we look forward to seeing you over there. Do you want to see the impact we can have on your organisation? Then get in touch through our website or email the team on inquiries@thecolourworks.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.